Hello and welcome to episode number 50 of Behind the Impact. I'm your host, Jeremy Brown. In this episode, Ty Wingfield, the workplace experience and responsible business lead at Unity, joins the show. Ty, welcome to Behind the Impact.
Thank you for having me.
I am looking forward to learning more about your background and learning from your experience at Unity. But before we get into Unity, what I would really love to do is just learn more about your background and how you got into social impact. Can you give me that backstory?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's sort of an interesting story. The majority of my career has been spent in marketing and communications consulting roles. And over time, my love for storytelling, for narrative development, for also kind of taking very complex challenges and distilling them in a way that the layperson can understand has always been a strength of mine and part of my unique skill set. And so I did that for a number of years, moved into a role where I was leading an area of a business focused on diversity and inclusion consulting. Which was great. I worked across a number of different clients and companies who had very different challenges. Unity was actually a client of mine at the time. And it was great to just sort of better understand sort of the connection between inclusion, diversity, and business success. Of course, there was a lot of work that we were also doing in partnership with our client social impact team, sustainability functions. And so I developed a deep knowledge and passion for that kind of overarching area. And during my time at coming over to Unity, initially leading our inclusion work, it I think became very clear to me and also to our leadership team that there were a lot of functions that touch the work or should be much more interconnected, should be much more integrated in a business. And so, sort of, moving forward a couple of years in my role at Unity, I'm now overseeing our employee experience and responsible business teams. We know that being a responsible business, includes how you treat your employees, how you treat and engage with the communities that you serve. And so it made a lot of sense that these sort of two what typically are siloed areas in many companies, that these two areas and distinct, historically distinct functions came together under one umbrella. And what's been great about this current role is that we're able to sort of thread these pieces together in a way that's organic, ensuring that our sustainability work, our inclusion work, our work in just social impact more broadly is much more integrated and embedded in our business practices.
So your background is super unique in that you have a marketing and communications background. Not many practitioners have that, but we all know the importance of storytelling as well as external and internal communications. If you were to give advice to other practitioners about storytelling, what have you learned throughout your career about telling compelling stories?
They have to be steeped in authenticity and honesty, right? So, if we think back to 2020, right, that was a pivotal moment in my career, it's a pivotal moment in our country as we think about just all that was evolving with the murder of George Floyd and a lot of companies, being very vocal about their commitments to inclusion and diversity and I think at the time, there was this tendency for companies to sort of jump into the fray, make commitments, and just have their voice out there without being honest and authentic about where they were in their own journey, right? I think there was a hesitancy to be honest that maybe historically we hadn't invested as much in this space, but we see the benefit, we see the need, we see the importance of doing that now. And I think for companies that kind of stepped into that space in a way that was inauthentic. Their employees knew it, they spoke up about it, the communities in which they operated knew it and spoke up about it, and they received some pushback and some backlash as a result. But when you look at companies that told their stories in a much more authentic way, in an honest way. It came from an honest place. And then, of course, supporting that with actually doing the work. They were received in a much more positive way by both their internal stakeholders, their employees, but also externally. And so I think the storytelling, one, I see it as important. I also think there's a tendency to withhold telling your story until you have it just right. And that misses the mark as well, right? I think when you're not talking about what you're doing, the perception is you're not doing anything. And more often than not, that's not true. And so I think communicating along the way about your journey and being honest about where you are, being honest where there are pitfalls, to the extent possible, just uh, makes the perception of what you're doing as an individual, as a company, as an enterprise, much more relatable, honest, and generally, you're viewed in a much more positive light as a result.
In terms of communicating along the way, can you give an example of what that might look like? That way, practitioners kind of have a little bit of context.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're just starting out, right? Or maybe you're making a big pivot as a company and you're reorging. Um, one, I think you're always starting with your internal stakeholders, your
Mm.
employees. They are your biggest advocates. They can serve as your biggest and loudest ambassadors. And so, ensuring that you're communicating in a way that, again, is open and honest about where you are. But I think when you set certain milestones, so if you're saying in 1 year, our vision is to be here, in 2 years, it's here, in 5 years from now, it's here, making sure that you're following up during those moments in time and saying, hey, we're a year out. Here's where we are. We didn't quite hit this goal, but here's what we're doing to correct for that. Or we've exceeded, these three goals. And so again, being honest along the way, sharing feedback, and not just sort of waiting until that moment when you have it all right. Because again, the perception along the way is that you're not doing anything when you could be taking some really important critical steps. And so I think it's being intentional and setting the stage for you'll hear from us again in a year. You'll hear from us in 6 months with an update. And when you're honest, even if you've had setbacks, generally you see that you'll be given a bit of grace because you're being honest and because you're putting in the work to improve.
One thing I always appreciate about companies when it comes to the honesty piece, especially in their impact reports, is when they share a status update, whether it's good, bad, or they miss the mark, or they, like to your point, they exceeded it. They're still sharing that. They're not hiding or anything like that. So I really appreciate companies that do lead with honesty about where they're at in that journey.
Yeah, absolutely.
In terms of internal communications, and really what I'm trying to hone in on is communicating with stakeholders like executives, for example. What does good internal communications look like for an impact practitioner who is trying to share the work that they're doing and or their team is doing?
Yeah. So I think a big part of this work and where we focus at Unity is um, in how this work, how our work collectively as an organization is helping to move the needle on behalf of our customers, internally on behalf of our employees, and also just thinking writ large about the industry. And so what we always try and do when we're proposing a new initiative or when we're presenting to the board or to our executive team with a status update or a proposal for a new project is to make sure that we're very clear about our work being designed to strengthen the resilience of our industry, the real time ecosystem. And so everything that we're tying back to how this will expand our talent pipelines, how this will increase trust internally, or address social environmental risks that affect long-term growth for the industry. And so I think when you communicate that way, and then of course, when you back it up with metrics, right? And you can show here's where we are, here's where we intend to be over time. We always want to make sure that we're clear that when impact is aligned with real business constraints like talent shortages or regulatory pressure, it stops being optional. And that's always been my focus, whether it was in the inclusion space, in the employee experience space, um, social impact, change management. It's always making sure that the work is viewed and seen and positioned as integrated, as a core piece of the business and how we operate, and that it's not optional. It's not something that we're doing on the side as a nice to have. And so, again, I think the work that we're doing, the actions we're taking also have to be paired with that narrative. Otherwise, because some of these topics are pretty heady, and are pretty complex. And so, without that narrative, I think that story can get lost, and it's an important one, right? And that's what our business leaders care about. That's what our stakeholders, our investors care about. And so, we make sure to tie that into everything that we do, every opportunity we have, and to get in front of our leadership team, in front of the board, we connect it back to the impact it will have on our customers, on our communities, on the industry, on the business.
There are so many ways that practitioners can make a material impact on their companies. From your vantage point and through your experience, what are some of the ways, and you mentioned some of them like talent pipeline shortages and things like that. What are some of the ways that impact work and practitioners can make that impact internally on their businesses?
Yeah, I think so. There's a couple of ways that we look at this, and sort of what impact at Unity looks like in practice. And we think about it through our products, through our people, through our communities. And I think there are a lot of companies that do that. And of course, products, people, and communities will look different based on the industry and the organization. But when we think about maybe starting with our products, it looks like enabling creators who use our technology. It looks like enabling creators to build solutions for societal challenges. So we have an initiative called Unity for Humanity, and we're helping to fund social impact creators who are creating games or experiences to support, individuals who may be struggling with a phobia, who are supporting, clean and renewable energy work, right, through a game or through immersion or immersive experiences. And so, in our products, that's what it looks like. It also looks like enabling the industry and our customers to create games that are much more energy efficient. And so, talking about what that looks like, I think when we look at people, across people, it shows up in how we design employee experience, right? How we think about what equitable growth for our global distributed teams looks like, what inclusive systems look like in terms of how we assess talent and think about fairness, purpose driven engagement, right? And so, we think about impact in that way when we look internally at how our employees experience the work and experience Unity day to day. um, and then when we think about our communities, it's about access, right? And this is, a kind of an industry-wide effort. We have a lot of customers and peers that we partner with in this space, but access, supporting our future creators, those who are in high school and university level, who are pursuing, future jobs in this industry. It's helping to support their future goals. It's creating workforce pathways. Maybe you are early in your career, mid-career, and are thinking of switching or obtaining a new skill set or experience. And so, it's investment in that way. And also, of course, looking at talent that are maybe located in certain areas of the world, of the country, where they don't have the same access to mentors, to jobs. And so, how do we support some of those underrepresented groups, so that ultimately our broader ecosystem can keep renewing itself, right? Without people, without products, without these communities, we fail. And so, we look at impact as sort of that, in our work, as the connective tissue that kind of reinforces Unity's ability to innovate and to scale in a way that's responsible.
So really the message that I'm hearing is for practitioners, you have the ability to really make a difference inside your companies. It's not just about writing checks and doing volunteering events, although those are really important components to the overall kind of work, but you have the ability to influence in so many areas. And so I think that's what practitioners really need to understand.
Absolutely. And I mean, when you think about it, because those are sort of big picture, our kind of big pillars that we talk about, and we have visuals, and you'll see it on our website. But I mean, when you think about um, the capabilities and the experience that have really helped to advance the work that we're doing in my team and social impact and employee experience, I think, you want to think about systems thinking, right? Understanding how policies and culture and operations can reinforce or undermine impact, right? So you want to have a line of sight into that. You want to know also kind of or be fluent in business trade-offs, right? Know when to push, know when to adapt. How do you translate impact into business language that leaders actually use? And when I say when to push, when to adapt, again, every company is at a different stage in their own journey in this space. And so, understanding and some companies may take two steps forward and one step back for a multitude of reasons. So, it's being able to be adaptable and flexible so that you can still continue on a path that gets you to your intended outcomes, but that may require at some points adjusting or scaling back or scaling up to ensure that you still are able to drive that longer term impact. I think, again, going back to storytelling, right? Data and storytelling together. You can't sort of have one on its own. You have to be able to back any data, any number, any figure that you have with the story that goes behind it. And then I think increasingly it's important that practitioners have partnership design, that they're able to both inside of the company and externally pull in the right partners, the right collaborators, so that this work again isn't just sitting in one function, but ultimately it's being owned and driven by a collection of different functions and individuals. You're able to scale and have that much more impact than you would if you're doing it just through the lens of one kind of siloed area of the business.
If a company and practitioner were early in their kind of impact journey, where should they start in terms of creating a program, a function that can scale?
That's a really good question. And it's I hear it often. I see it often. I've experienced it, where maybe you're coming into this work and you don't have a big team or you don't have a lot of money, which I think a lot of practitioners in this space can relate to. There's still ways that you can make a huge impact and scale the work, right? And so one where I started at Unity, where I've started in every new role that I've taken on, and even I continue to do sort of each year is assess where you are, right? There's usually a spectrum of, are we sort of in this early stage bucket where maybe we're doing the bare minimum, it's more of a compliance kind of focused effort. We're partnering closely with legal, which you will always have to do and should do and need to do, but maybe that's kind of where it sits right now. But you really want to move it more from this sort of compliance driven. Maybe the next step is to get it more, programmatic, right? You have some programs in place, you have some structures in place, you can pull in others from the business to ultimately having it be embedded in everything that you do as an organization. But then breaking that down, I think even further. So one, understanding where are we in this spectrum of our own journey? Are we in this programmatic stage? If we are, great. What do we need to do? What are the right steps based on where we are as a business? What do we have the appetite for to start moving us in the direction longer term to have this become much more embedded in the business? And I think once you have that early stage assessment, it takes a lot of discussions with your executive team, with their direct reports, with other peers or partners across the business to get that firm understanding. You have some data that can support that as well. Once you go through that exercise, I think you'll have a clearer line of sight into maybe some of the barriers or gaps that you're up against, but also you're in a stronger position to map a clear path forward. Now, again, going back to resourcing, right? Maybe you're also resource constrained, both in terms of people resources and financial resources. It's important then to think about who are my allies or advocates or partners that sit within different functions of the business, right? So maybe initially you have to operate more as a center of excellence, and you're pulling in support, you're consulting your engineering teams, you're consulting your benefits team and getting their support. You're weighing in on new procedures or policies, and you want to make sure that social impact or sustainability is embedded or a part of that discussion. And that's kind of how you build advocacy. That's also how you start to build these case studies that show return on investment and can have a much stronger case to request additional resources or additional funding as you start to show results. And so if you're coming in and you have, a huge team and budget, that's not your challenge. It's more about mobilizing and scaling. But I think, a lot of times you'll hear some teams almost get in their own way. We don't have the resources, we don't have the people. I think there are a lot of workarounds. If you get a customer involved, a partner, if you're in consulting and you're getting clients on board, that's another way to really push the needle. I can say specifically in sustainability, we're seeing a lot of our customers become increasingly vocal about what they expect their partners and their clients to have embedded as a part of just how they operate responsibly. They're expecting that you meet a certain threshold to even sign a contract with you. And that's just helped to move the work at a much faster pace. It's helped to start to move the work from beyond just a, compliance regulatory exercise to something that our customers are demanding. We are doing the same in terms of putting pressure on our suppliers as well. And so, you see this impact that you're having, your ability to scale. But I think getting those internal allies and also external advocates and allies can really help move the work along. But again, I'd say, as a baseline starting point, you really want to take an assessment and understand where your company is in the journey, and then also gain that understanding of what the company today has the appetite to take on and try and work within those parameters as you move forward.
You mentioned something very important, and that's customer expectations. Can you talk a little bit about what could happen if a company doesn't meet the moment in terms of meeting or even exceeding those customer expectations?
Yeah, I mean, and I think it depends on where you sit. If you are a B2C company, and you are, kind of customer facing, it can have a huge impact on your bottom line. I think increasingly there are a lot of studies that have been done that show that individuals, that consumers want to put their money and their dollars behind organizations that are aligned with their own values and morals. There are a multitude of studies that show job seekers and employees want to work and grow within companies whose mission and values are aligned with their own. And so a lot of what we're seeing when you unpack some of that data are that, consumers and employees are expecting that companies are responsible citizens, right? That they are considering their impact on the environment when they operate, that they are treating their employees fairly, they're paying them fairly, that they're assessing their talent fairly. And so when organizations aren't taking this seriously, and and I think on the customer side, right, contractually they can put this language in their contracts and refuse to either do business or reduce the size of business, or cut off business at a certain point if you aren't meeting a certain threshold. And so that's a way that you see customers, I think, holding companies accountable. But you're also seeing it from a very vocal employee base and also consumer base, right? We're seeing it in the way of, a lot of brands. Even today, I think Target has been just the kind of poster child for this, who pulled back on some of their efforts, and consumers are boycotting. And they're just, enthralled in a lot of different, very kind of visible political challenges right now, but I think it's a clear example, agnostic of where you sit in terms of what Target should or shouldn't be doing. I think that's an example of what can happen, if consumers or your customers aren't aligned with the moves that you're making as a business.
Yeah, that example with Target, and there's other examples too. Those are the examples that practitioners need to internalize. And when they're having, conversations with executives, for example, they need to bring those type of examples to the surface because it's important for executives to understand the implications if you're not meeting or exceeding customer expectations when it comes to the impact or sustainability of your business. And so this is kind of like almost like a tactic for practitioners to use to advocate for the work.
That's right. And you listen also, right? And so that was that's always been a big takeaway from my work and my training as a communicator. A big part of being an effective communicator is listening. Is understanding what um what all of your stakeholders want, what they expect, what they need, and then understanding what incentivizes them to move. And so, if you are an organization, it's important that you're doing employee listening, that you're surveying your customers to understand what they want, what they expect. What are some deeper ways that you can partner to make the work, be much more holistic? And so it's critical, I think, when, going back to your earlier question around where do you start, part of that assessment of understanding where you are as a business and what those sort of next steps look like to get you on a path to scale and embedding the work is also going back through any employee survey data that you have and understanding what they're expecting, what they're seeing, what they're feeling. If you aren't doing that currently, I think, now is as good of a time as ever to, you don't have to do a large scale survey, but you can do smaller focus groups just to start getting more of a pulse on what your people, what your core stakeholders expect.
Let's talk a little bit more about Unity. Now, if you're in gaming or you are a gamer, Unity, it's a name that you know very well. For those who may not have heard of Unity, what does Unity do?
Yeah, great question. So Unity builds the real time 3D platform that powers games and immersive experiences, increasingly non gaming industries like automotive and architecture. And at its core, Unity really sits at the intersection of creativity and technology. So we enable creators to build, run, and ultimately grow interactive experiences across various platforms. And so I think what's really important to remember and know about Unity is that it isn't just a tools company. We're an ecosystem company. Our long-term health depends on creators being able to enter, to stay, and to thrive in that ecosystem.
Now, I want to go back to a question that I asked just a bit ago in terms of where to start if you're early on in your impact journey. When you joined Unity, can you go back to that time and talk a little bit about where you started and how it has evolved over the years?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I took my own advice. So, when I first joined Unity, I spent probably the first 3 months really digging into the company, understanding the business, right?
Mm.
Understanding our core revenue drivers, understanding our stakeholders, what our customers do, where we expect it to see growth in the next year to 2 to 3 years. But I also did a lot of stakeholder interviews. I spoke with maybe, I don't know, 50 stakeholders across various levels and functions and geographies to understand. At the time it was, I had a sole focus on global inclusion. And so it was understanding what's really worked well, what hasn't worked well, what practices do we have in place already. I, spoke in detail with our talent team at the time to understand what trainings we had available, how our performance assessments conducted, what are the scales that we use to assess, a high performer, average to low performer, but really digging into and unpacking both the sentiment of how people were feeling. Did they feel they belong? Looking at the data and also understanding just in actual terms what are the procedures and policies and programs that currently exist? And then again, going through and sort of mapping us against a continuum of where we are. Are we in this compliance stage? Are we in more of a programmatic stage? Which at the time, that's kind of where we sat, right? Inclusion work was more of a function that was a bit siloed from the business. We were doing a lot of great programs. We had some very active and visible and amazing employee resource groups, which we still have, but they were sort of off over here doing their own thing. And there wasn't a lot of integration with the business. And so that was our starting point. It was then, okay, let's speak with our client relationship managers and understand, more about what our clients are seeking in this space and how we can be supportive from the inclusion side. When I took over our social impact team, I did the same thing, right? I think we were a little further along in our social impact journey. We had some very visible and successful programs in place like Unity for Humanity that were very kind of clear um, value adds to the company and to our customers. And so we had a different starting point then, but it was the same process, digging in, understanding the data, where we're starting from, what is it that we want to accomplish, where do we see gaps, and moving from there.
Understanding the business. How does a practitioner go about doing that in terms of who should they talk to? What type of data or metrics they should be looking at just to get a clear understanding of where the business is, what the business cares about, and then from there being able to then map their work to moving the needle for the business.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it, when I joined Unity, I read a lot of our just former investor reports. So a lot of it is reading, right? Seeing what's available, looking at our annual plans, previous plans, our current state plans, and so digging into just a lot of the actual content that we had. But then during my one-on-ones, I usually conclude the calls, especially with our executive team, on what else should I know about your function? Who else should I speak with? If they mentioned, a new product that was in development, I'd ask if it was okay if I reached out to the lead of that team to just better understand the product. So oftentimes, once I sort of got into that second layer of interviews, I was kind of asking more about the work that was happening versus getting an assessment of where you stood with inclusion, or does your team feel they belong, but better understanding, what are we working toward? What's our expected revenue? How do we expect to achieve that? How is the market responding? I think those are all important questions. And a lot of time, again, I mean, starting with some of those initial interviews and asking who else you can speak with, paying attention and listening to what the leader is saying about the direction of their area of the business, and then identifying the right people who can give you kind of more insight there, I think is really important. We also just do a lot of work with our teams that are managing our customer relationships, because they're closest to what's top of mind for customers, what's top of mind in the industry. And we've learned a lot that way. I think we're in the very early stages of launching, hopefully, a new really exciting early career program with some of our customers because of those relationships that we've built with our internal customer success teams. And so, a lot of new ideas can also begin to brew, both from your team as a practitioner, but also on the side of customers, or the business, who may not really understand what your team does or the value add that you can bring to the work that they do every day. And so, um, rolling in or thinking back to the storytelling piece, some of it is helping to connect the dots. So there were quite a few instances earlier in my career at Unity where, the sort of next step coming out of those discussions were, here's an idea, or would it be helpful if my team creates a dashboard that you can share with your customer to show, the impact that our work on energy efficiency is doing in terms of the value of their game, et cetera. And so, I think being able to understand what it is they're seeking to address, or the goals that they have in place to meet, and being able to identify how the work that you're doing in the social impact space can help advance that. Not only does that quickly show, a return on investment, but I think it also opens up doors for longer term engagement and advocacy in areas of the business that maybe you didn't even realize could be strong partners for you in the long term.
Roughly when did you take over the social impact team?
It was about a year and a half ago, actually. And so at the end of 2024, and I think it was a pretty seamless transition because our sustainability, our social impact team were teams that we worked with regularly on the inclusion side, and so it was a pretty seamless transition because one, we knew the people working behind these various areas, but we already had so much overlap in our programs and even in how we were approaching the work that the integration was pretty seamless. And then recently, last year, I also took over our real estate team, our physical security team, our design and construction teams, and our workplace experience team. So it's a much bigger portfolio, but and because the team is much more sizable than it was previously, the integration has taken a bit longer, but in terms of the subject matter and how we align our goals and how we function as one organization, to me has been pretty straightforward because, again, when you think about our responsible business side of the house, inclusion, sustainability, social impact, and you pair it with all of these, core areas like real estate, these operational areas, right? Physical security, these are all about how we make sure that we are showing up responsibly in terms of where we work, our people, and the communities that we serve. And so having it now all sit under one umbrella has been instrumental in ensuring that the responsible business side of my portfolio is just that much more integrated in how we operate as a business. And it's been great. It's been really great to see. I think initially both sides of the house were sort of thinking, how is this going to work? And, we're about 6 months into that, our new structure, and it's become much more apparent. And I think we've been able to, kind of get rid of a lot of silos because we now all sit under one umbrella. So it's been a really great, I think, change for the company and collectively for our teams as well.
That's quite a portfolio of functions under kind of one umbrella. And obviously, every function brings kind of their own speciality to the mix. I'm curious to learn more about, how you've been able to establish the vision and ensure everyone is, marching to the same drum beat.
Yeah, I think, similarly, so I'll use our sustainability team as one example. Historically and, currently they work very closely with our real estate team and thinking about any new offices that we open or offices that we expand and what the environmental impact of that may be and where we can be more efficient. They've worked closely with our environmental health and safety teams in a similar function in gathering our data, right? And so now these two functions sit together, or these three functions sit together. And so we have, joint team meetings and offsites and joint dashboards where everything just sort of lives in one place versus this, you're pinging people or you're having to gather information. And so thinking about sustainability, um, for unity overall, I think it's become even more clear because we now, like, these core functions that impact sustainability and our sustainability efforts are all under one umbrella. So their goals, a lot of their goals are joint. We have as a team identified sort of, six or seven core initiatives or policies or procedures where all of these different functions have some influence, right? Where real estate, security, our charitable fund, inclusion kind of all touch this one area. And so what we've done is gone through as a team and identified those core kind of, um, key areas that multiple functions that sit under me touch. And we've then jointly designed what our collective goals will be, how we'll work together, what our standard operating processes will look like, what stakeholders we need to pull in and when, as opposed to, sustainability has this one plan, EHS has this other plan. We didn't know about that plan. Now we're trying to, get in on the back. We're doing it now in a much proactive and I think strategic way where we're looking at this work much more holistically than we were able to do before because we all sat under different functions and at times some of these functions sat outside of we sit under our chief people officer currently, but we were sitting under different business leaders, and so the layers were just we were much more distributed and kind of further down in the business. So it was a lot more challenging. There were a lot more steps to take to get that integration. And so we're designing our entire strategy together. Of course, there are areas that our physical security team will be working on that don't necessarily touch sustainability. But the first sort of order of action for us when we first came together after our reorganization was to identify what are the things that we all touch and maybe now we aren't but we should all be touching, and let's start from there and build. And it's just been really great and eye-opening for me. I've not overseen a function design in this way previously, so it's been there's been a lot of learning, but it's been eye-opening, and I think a really good kind of case example of how these functions can come together in a really organic and strategic and impactful way for a company like Unity.
All right, let's zoom out a little bit and talk more about the overall corporate impact landscape. Obviously, there's a lot going on right now. Obviously, from a political standpoint, but also just from a business standpoint, where there's layoffs happening, budgets are being cut, etc. And one thing that has been a challenge for practitioners is to communicate the value of their work in a way that executives can understand and connect the dots themselves. Obviously, executives are many of them don't know what impact is all about from a business beneficial perspective. If you had to give advice to other practitioners about communicating the value of impact work and how it connects back to the business, what advice would you give those individuals?
So I think one thing you mentioned here, like, some assumptions that executives may make, and practitioners are, oftentimes sort of caught on their back foot and they're trying to catch up or correct for it. I think an assumption that we see, and I see this because I've worked on the marketing and communication side as well, is that impact can be measured in the same way as marketing campaigns. And impact work often comes through systems change. We saw that, in inclusion as well. It's not short-term attribution. You're thinking about how do you change a behavior or how do you completely disrupt a system, and you see that play out year over year. You see the value add, come 2 years out. It's not a matter of sort of capturing how many views you have or clicks a campaign received. And so I think practitioners in social impact spend a lot of time reframing success as like a reduced risk, um, or avoided cost, not just kind of immediate return on investment there. And so I think again, one assumption that executives can make is we should be able to see the same thing or the same value as we would in marketing. And so show us ROI. So we have to sort of redefine what ROI looks like in this space for executives in a way that they can understand. I think in terms of where you start in this kind of crazy time that we're all navigating in the world, you want to think about, and you mentioned cutbacks and rifts and downturns, right? Like those are also usually times when social impact functions are the first to get cut or seen as less than business critical. And so I think it's important to be able to articulate clearly whether the work is discretionary or embedded. That's what kind of separates, I think, impact functions that get cut or that remain sort of in the way that they need to, right, to drive business critical work. I think programs that sit outside of core workflows are much more easier to cut, right? You think about employee giving initiatives or volunteer efforts. It's those things are easy to cut or to deprioritize because they seem like they're nice to haves, right? And so there's a big, and this should happen from the beginning, not just when you see the writing on the wall and you get wind that there may be cutbacks, but at the very beginning, it's being able to define and clearly articulate why and how this work should be tied to the business, right? Functions that are tied to talent pipelines, that are tied to compliance, that are tied to customer expectations that we spoke about earlier, or workforce stability. Those are the functions that become much more harder to remove because the business will feel the absence immediately, right? They'll feel it because employees are talking about it or customers are pulling away. And so again, the constant theme that I always think about in how I structure the work, but also in how I talk about the work and how we measure the impact and success of the work is how embedded or integrated are we in the core workflows and the core business. And again, if you're operating and you're managing your team as a separate team that is more of a cost, right? A cost center, then when times are hard and when there are cuts, those are typically again the first areas to get to be cut. And so if you want to assess kind of what that looks like, right? I think you're funded through core budget. So some of the work and the programs that we're in the early stages of producing are being funded through the business, right? They may be funded in part through HR or through our charitable fund, but they're funded also in partnership through the business, through some of our, in partnership with some of our customers. And so they're funded through core budgets, not just leftover dollars. We want to make sure that when we're talking about location strategy or um, our product line, that all of this work that we're doing is referenced in those business plans. Again, they're not just value statements, but they are a part of our annual business planning, that more than one leader can be held accountable for outcomes in this space, right? So, how do we create goals and standards that our leaders are expected to make in responsible business? These don't just sit, these metrics or these OKRs don't just sit within my function. And so, again, I think when you're structured that way, it doesn't mean that you're 100% riff proof or reduction proof, but the work will continue. Um, you know, even, you know, even in times of trouble or cutback, the work still continues because it's so closely embedded and aligned with the business. And so I think that again, in terms of how you talk about it, how you measure it, the programs that you develop, you should always be thinking through that vein of how does this connect back to the business? What business value will this give us? Do we have customers that can speak out on our behalf, right? In terms of the value that this brought to our broader relationship. And so that's how we're approaching the work. And again, I think because of how we're now structured as this broader employee experience, responsible business team, it's a little bit more organic to do just that.
Now, this might be just a too simple. Maybe it might be more complex, but is it safe to say, in terms of being embedded into the company, in terms of corporate impact being embedded, a practitioner can kind of test how embedded they are by thinking, if my function was cut tomorrow, would the company really feel the burn? If the answer is no, then maybe you're truly not embedded. But if the answer is yes, then you are deeply embedded in the company.
Yes, but I think there's a gray. There's again, it's thinking about it as a journey, and sometimes if you're in the early stages of doing this and maybe you have a few um a few areas where you're doing a lot of cross-functional work. You have some cross-functional over ownership with, legal and finance and maybe product. Um, there may be a gray where it's starting, and so there may be some impact, but maybe the impact, isn't like we're failing now as a business because we do or don't have this. But I think over time you will see that. So over time, if you've built the expectation with your top clients that you will meet this certain threshold, in terms of the work that you do in sustainability or social impact, and all of a sudden that's gone, or there's no one there to manage that, yeah, I mean, your business is at risk. I think though a goal is also, again, to build those strong partnerships. So even if there's an impact on your team, right? You have someone on the customer success side who understands, has been working with you hand in hand on how to advance this work. And so at a minimum, they can carry on the work in the short term, right? And so it's building that cross-functional ownership. It just becomes a part of people's job. You're serving as sort of the consultants almost and the drivers of the strategy, but everyone in the business and people and legal and product and finance should be executing it. And yeah, if the that kind of centralized team were to go away, the strategy falters, right? And so there is a real risk to the business. And so you would say yes, right? If you're checking a box. And that's ultimately where you want to be. So ultimately you want to get to yes. But I think there's a gray area in the middle that can show you might have some level of integration. You may not be all the way there yet, but there will be some level of impact if you were to pull back on X, Y, or Z. So I and kind of long way to answer your question. I do think that's right, but there is this kind of middle piece where, there is a continuum, I think, in terms of how integrated you are in a business.
All right, last question for you. If you had to make a prediction about where corporate impact will be in the next 5 to 7 years, what would your prediction be?
My prediction, I think, is also coupled with my hope. I hope that, and this is, based on my experience, I hope that we'll see fewer standalone impact roles and more hybrid leaders who are fluent in sustainability, who are fluent in risk and inclusion and workforce strategy. Because I see, right? I see it at Unity. I've seen it at companies that I've worked with in the past, that organizations that win treat impact as a core business capability, not, this nice to have, this kind of moral add-on. It is core to how you function as a business. And as practitioners, it's our job to make it that, to advocate for that, to put the right processes and structures in place to get there. But when you achieve that sort of, that core integration, your company wins, right? And I think the gap will widen between companies that embed impact into how they operate and those that kind of just quietly exit the space. So I think my prediction is, we'll see fewer of these standalone sort of siloed roles or functions and much more integration into the business. So
Ty, thank you so much for joining me and walking me through your career experience and journey and kind of pulling back the curtain on Unity in terms of how impact works at the company. What you're doing there is so compelling. And I do believe more practitioners need to take notice and learn from what you're doing and the rest of the team is doing. So thank you so much for sharing all of that.
thank you. Thanks for having me.
This episode is brought to you by Social Impact World, the intelligence layer for corporate impact. To learn more, go to socialimpactworld.com. I'm Jeremy Brown. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Behind the Impact.